No one in that quiet roadside diner thought much of the old man in the corner booth, until a hardened member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club noticed the bruises circling his wrists like fading handcuffs. And in that single moment, a truth buried under silence, fear, and shame began to claw its way into the light. It was just past 8 a.m., the kind of slow morning where the world felt half awake, with sunlight slipping lazily through dusty windows and the smell of burnt toast and cheap coffee hanging in the air, when Marcus Grave Dalton pushed open the diner door, the low growl of his bike still echoing faintly outside. Heads turned, as they always did, not out of curiosity but instinct, because men like Marcus carried a presence that unsettled people before he even spoke. Yet he wasn't looking for attention, wasn't looking for trouble either, just a cup of coffee and a place to sit, something steady in a life that rarely was. He slid onto a stool at the counter, nodded once at the waitress, and wrapped his hands around a chipped mug as if grounding himself, his eyes scanning the room in that quiet, habitual way of someone who had learned long ago that the smallest details often hid the biggest stories. And that's when he saw him. The old man, tucked away in the far booth like he was trying not to exist, shoulders hunched, movements careful, almost rehearsed, as if even lifting a spoon required permission. At first, there was nothing unusual about him. Diners were full of lonely people, after all, men and women carrying invisible weights. But something about this one lingered, something that didn't sit right, and Marcus couldn't have said what it was, not yet, until the man reached for his cup, and the sleeve of his worn shirt slid back just enough to reveal it. A dark, ugly ring of bruises wrapped around his wrist, deep purple fading into sickly yellow, the unmistakable mark of force, not accident. Marcus didn't look away. Most people would have. Most people did. But he watched, quietly, as the man adjusted his sleeve again, too quickly, too deliberately, like someone used to hiding something they couldn't explain. And then it clicked. Not just the bruises, but the way the man's eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds, the way his back stiffened whenever someone moved too fast, the way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, when the waitress set down his plate. "You okay, Mr. Harris?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the kind of concern that came from familiarity, not suspicion. "Yes, yes," the old man replied, his smile thin and fragile, like it might break if anyone looked too closely. Just fine." But Marcus knew that kind of smile. He'd seen it in men twice as strong and 3 times as dangerous. Men who'd been broken in ways that didn't leave visible scars, and he knew it meant one thing. Something was wrong, and the person living it had convinced themselves it was better to pretend it wasn't. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving the old man, noticing more now, the slight tremor in his hands, the careful way he ate, like every movement was measured, controlled, restricted. And then, when the man reached again, the sleeve slipped further this time, and Marcus saw more bruises along the forearm, not random, not scattered, but patterned, deliberate, like someone had grabbed him there more than once, hard enough to leave a message. That was it. That was the moment Marcus couldn't ignore anymore. He stood up, the scrape of his stool against the floor cutting through the quiet, and walked over, not aggressive, not confrontational, just steady, like a man who had already decided he wasn't walking away. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. The old man looked up, startled, his eyes darting briefly to the door before settling on Marcus, uncertainty written across his face. I suppose not," he said, gesturing weakly to the seat across from him. Marcus sat, leaning back slightly, giving the man space, not crowding him, not pushing yet. Up close, it was worse. The bruises weren't just visible, they were undeniable. "Rough morning?" Marcus asked casually, as if making small talk, as if he hadn't already seen enough to know the answer mattered more than the question. The old man chuckled softly, a hollow sound. Something like that. There was a pause, thick with things unsaid, and then Marcus nodded toward his wrist. "That doesn't look like something like that." The old man's hand instinctively pulled back, his sleeve tugged down again in a practiced motion. "Oh, this?" he said quickly. "Just clumsy. Old bones, you know how it is." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying him, not buying it for a second. "Yeah," he replied, his tone even, almost gentle. "I know what clumsy looks like. That ain't it." The old man's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time, and in that silence, something shifted, not in the room, but in the old man himself, like the weight he'd been carrying was suddenly harder to hold. "You live around here?" Marcus asked, easing the tension just enough to keep the conversation alive. "With my son," the man said, his voice quieter now. "He takes care of me." Marcus nodded slowly, the words echoing in his mind, not because of what they said, but because of how they were said, and then he glanced once more at the bruises, at the fear the man couldn't quite hide, and something cold settled in his chest. "Yeah," he said softly. "Looks like he does." The old man's fingers tightened slightly around his cup, as if those quiet words had pressed against something he had been trying desperately to keep buried, and for a moment, he didn't respond, just stared down at the table like the answers might be written somewhere in the wood grain, waiting for him to find the courage to read them. Marcus didn't rush him. He had learned long ago that truth didn't come from pressure. It came from patience, from giving someone just enough space to realize they weren't as alone as they thought. So instead, he signaled the waitress and ordered a full breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, the works, and when the plate arrived, he gently nudged it toward the old man. "Eat," he said, not as a command, but as something steadier, something grounding. The old man hesitated at first, glancing toward the door again. That same nervous reflex, like he expected someone to burst in at any second and drag him away for doing something as simple as accepting kindness. But when nothing happened, he slowly picked up his fork and took a bite, and then another, and something almost invisible began to change. His shoulders lowered a fraction, his breathing steadied, and the tightness in his face softened just enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath. Marcus watched quietly, letting the moment stretch, letting the man remember what it felt like to not be afraid of every small thing. And only then did he lean forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "What's his name?" The old man froze mid-motion, the fork hovering in the air again, and this time, the silence felt different, heavier, more dangerous. "Daniel," he said finally, the name barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded once. "Your son." A small nod. "And those bruises?" The old man's lips pressed together, his eyes flickering with something that looked like shame more than fear now. And when he spoke again, his voice cracked just enough to betray him. He doesn't mean to." Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose, a quiet, controlled breath that masked the anger building inside him. He had heard that line before, too many times, in too many places, from too many people who had convinced themselves that pain was acceptable if it came wrapped in apology. "People usually don't," Marcus replied, his tone even. "Doesn't stop it from happening, though." The old man didn't argue. Instead, he set the fork down carefully, his hands trembling again. And for the first time since Marcus had sat down, he didn't try to hide it. "He says I forget things," the old man continued, his words slow, like each one had to push past something blocking it. "Says I wander, leave doors open, make trouble." Marcus listened, his gaze steady. "And what happens when you make trouble?" Another pause, longer this time. And when the old man finally looked up, his eyes were glassy, the kind of look that came from holding back tears for far too long. "He gets frustrated," he said. "Says he has to keep me safe." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Safe?" he repeated. "Yeah." The old man nodded quickly, almost desperately, as if clinging to that word. "He ties my wrists sometimes, just at night, so I don't wander," he added, his voice shrinking with each sentence, like he already knew how it sounded out loud, but couldn't stop himself now that it had started. "Not too tight," he said quickly, as if trying to defend it, to soften it, to make it acceptable. "Just enough." Marcus didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, really looked at him, at the bruises, at the fear, at the way this man had convinced himself that being restrained like an animal was somehow care. "And the marks on your arms?" Marcus asked quietly. The old man swallowed hard. "Sometimes he has to hold me still," he admitted. "When I don't listen." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable now, and something inside Marcus shifted from suspicion to certainty. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't care. This was control. "Anyone else know about this?" Marcus asked. The old man shook his head immediately, panic flashing across his face again. No. Please, you can't tell anyone, he said quickly, his voice rising just enough to draw a glance from the waitress before he lowered it again. He said if I talk, he'll send me away. Somewhere far. A home. I won't know anyone there. Marcus leaned back slightly, studying him, seeing now not just the bruises, but the trap, the fear of being alone used as a weapon, the manipulation wrapped in concern. You think this is better? Marcus asked gently. The old man didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, and as he did, the old man's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength for someone so frail. Please, he said, his voice breaking now, the fear no longer hidden. Don't make it worse. Marcus looked down at his hand, then back at his face, and for a moment, the hardened biker, the man who had faced down fights and chaos without flinching, felt something he hadn't expected, a deep, aching sadness. Listen to me, Marcus said quietly, his voice softer than it had been since he walked in. This doesn't get better by staying quiet. The old man's grip loosened slightly, but the fear remained. You don't understand, he whispered. He's all I have. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, he said. He's what's hurting you. The words landed harder than anything else, and the old man looked away, unable to face them, his eyes fixed back on his plate, untouched now, the brief moment of comfort gone. Marcus stood up then, not abruptly, not aggressively, just with quiet purpose, and he placed a few bills on the table before turning toward the door. I'll be right back, he said. The old man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at nothing, caught between fear and something else, something fragile, something new, something that looked almost like hope but didn't yet know how to exist. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, and Marcus took a long breath as he stepped away from the diner, pulling out his phone again, his expression hardening, not with anger alone, but with resolve, because he had seen enough to know one thing for certain. This wasn't just a bad situation, and it wasn't something he was going to walk away from. The low rumble of engines came first, distant at a glance, but growing louder by the second, until the quiet roadside diner seemed to vibrate with it, cups trembling slightly against saucers as every head turned toward the windows, and the old man in the corner booth stiffened instantly, fear flashing across his face as if that sound alone meant trouble had finally arrived. Marcus stepped back inside just as the first bike rolled into view, then another, and another, until a small line of leather-clad riders from the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club filled the parking lot, not storming in, not causing chaos, just arriving with a presence that said enough without a single word. The door opened behind Marcus as two of them entered quietly, taking positions by the counter, their eyes scanning the room but their posture relaxed, controlled, like men who knew exactly why they were there and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The old man's hands began to shake again. You said you wouldn't, he whispered, his voice tight with panic. They're not here to hurt anyone, Marcus said calmly, pulling his chair back and sitting down across from him again. They're here to make sure no one hurts you. Before the old man could respond, the sharp crunch of tires outside cut through the moment, followed by the slam of a car door. Quick, irritated footsteps heading straight for the entrance, and when the diner door swung open again, the tension shifted instantly. A man in his mid-30s stepped in, well-dressed, clean-cut, but with an edge in his expression that didn't match the image he tried to present. His eyes locked onto the old man immediately. There you are, he snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice through the room. I told you to stay home. The old man shrank slightly in his seat, instinctively pulling his hands closer to his body, his gaze dropping as if bracing for what might come next. I just wanted some coffee, he murmured. The man scoffed, stepping closer. You don't just do anything anymore, remember? You wander, you forget, you make problems. Then he noticed Marcus. And the others. The shift was subtle, but real. His confidence faltered for just a fraction of a second. What is this? He demanded, his tone sharpening, trying to reclaim control. Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. This, he said evenly, is where it stops. The man frowned. Excuse me. Marcus stepped forward, not aggressively, but enough to close the space between them, enough to make it clear he wasn't backing down. The bruises, Marcus continued. The wrists. The arms. That stops today. The man let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You've got no idea what you're talking about, he said quickly. He has dementia. I take care of him. Sometimes that means restraining him, for his own safety. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying him. Funny thing about care, he replied calmly. It doesn't usually leave marks like that. The man's jaw tightened. You think you can walk in here and tell me how to handle my own father? He snapped, his voice rising now, frustration creeping in. One of the bikers near the counter shifted slightly, not threatening, just present, and the man's voice faltered again, just for a second. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No, he said quietly. But I can tell when someone's being hurt. A heavy silence followed, thick enough to feel, and then one of the bikers stepped forward just enough to be seen, holding up his phone casually. Already called it in, he said. Welfare check. The words hit like a hammer. The man's face changed instantly, the color draining just a little, his confidence cracking under the weight of something he could no longer control. You had no right, he started, but the sound of sirens in the distance cut him off, growing louder with each passing second until they were impossible to ignore. The old man looked up, confusion and fear mixing in his eyes. What's happening? He whispered. Marcus turned back to him, his voice soft again. What should have happened a long time ago? The sirens grew louder, then stopped outside, doors opening, voices exchanging quick words, and within moments, 2 officers stepped into the diner, their presence calm but authoritative. The man straightened slightly, trying to regain composure. Officers, thank God, he said quickly. There's been a misunderstanding, but the officers didn't look at him first. They looked at the old man, at his wrists, at the bruises he could no longer hide. Sir, one of them said gently, stepping closer. Can you tell me what happened to your arms? The old man hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly toward his son, then to Marcus, then back to the officers, and for a moment, it seemed like he might retreat again, might fall back into the silence that had protected and imprisoned him for so long. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the presence around him. Maybe it was the fact that, for once, someone had noticed. Really noticed. His voice trembled as he spoke. I get tired sometimes, he admitted quietly. At night. The words hung in the air like a breaking point, and everything after that moved quickly. Questions, explanations, the son's defensive tone turning sharper, then desperate. Neighbors mentioned, concerns raised, patterns forming in real time as the truth unraveled piece by piece. The old man sat still through it all, his hands resting on the table now, no longer hidden, no longer pulled back, just there in the open where they should have been all along. Marcus sat beside him again, not saying much, just being there, steady, present. After a while, the noise faded into the background, the officers stepping outside with the sun, their voices quieter now but firm, and for the first time since the morning began, the diner felt still again. You okay? Marcus asked gently. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his hands, on the fading marks that had finally been seen. I thought, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought no one would ever notice. Marcus followed his gaze, then looked back at him, something heavy but honest in his expression. Yeah, he said softly. That's usually how it goes. The old man let out a small breath, not quite relief, not quite disbelief, but something in between, something that felt like the beginning of both. And as the morning light filtered through the diner windows once more, nothing about the place had changed. And yet, for the first time in a long time, everything had.